Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to this afternoon's sessions for the Watershed Management Workshop. And I will turn it right over to Michelle so she can start.
Michelle, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
That's probably better. Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mary. Hope everybody had a before here, or maybe if you weren't, we kind of went through what is going to, how a plan is going to look and what you're going to put into creating the plan while you're writing.
Michelle, can you get a little closer to the mic?
Maybe. Or I can at least talk louder. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So we have a plan. Now it is time to implement that plan. We said it before, and I'm going to just reiterate it that, you know what, good implementation needs a good plan. This is going to be your roadmap. And even when you have a good plan and you have a really good idea of what you want to accomplish, there are challenges getting ready for implementation. Some of the initial challenges, I'm sure that there could be a lot more on this list, and some of people might not have found some of the same challenges. But one of the things that we specifically found, and I've been hearing from other people from planning to implementation, some of the big challenges for a lot has been a large amount of turnover. Who you had working in different positions and everything during the planning stage might not still be with the office when it comes to implementation. Or there's just been challenges in keeping good staff. So that can make things a little bit difficult if you don't have your staff in place and you don't have the technical expertise to, you know, achieve those plans. Planning fatigue, you know, a lot of work, a lot of meetings, and a lot of effort goes into writing these plans. And you get a sense of, oh, we're done. We got our plan written. And then now it's time to move into implementation. And it can be hard to keep that momentum going when you've been putting so much effort into it to just keep moving and moving forward with where you're supposed to go next. And then where do we start? You know, we have a plan. Hopefully you have your grant, you have at least your watershed-based funding grant that you can start with. But there's so much more to figure out there. We have all these partners. Who's going to have what role? Who's going to be responsible for what? And then making sure that we're using the plan, adopting our daily operations to incorporate that plan. So that plan doesn't just sit on a shelf. We put all the effort into writing it. We need to make sure that it's being utilized. One of the things that we found to just kind of just get us started is just establishing some basic goals. What do we need to do to get moving? Do we need to hire an engineer? Do we need to, you know, get one on contract? Are we going to need to develop a relationship with TSA? Who is going to do all those things? But, you know, just each area of what we're going to do and kind of just set our own selves kind of almost internally some short goals of what we're going to do throughout those years. You know, we had said year one, we were going to secure 2 contracts, and then year 2 secure an additional 10 contracts. That ended up being you know, it was really easy for us to meet those first goals. And so each year we've looked at this and kind of the milestones and adjusted those so that we keep making sure that just small check-ins, that yes, we are making progress, that we are moving forward, and that we are actually working with and implementing the plan. Determining those roles. You have partner organizations. Um, if you're joint powers, you've probably kind of settled some of those stuff. We were working under an MOA, a memorandum of agreement. We wrote a different implementation MOA than the planning MOA. Who was the fiscal agent might not be the same when it comes to implementation as it was for planning. So who is that going to be? Who's going to hold the grants? Who's going to be the day-to-day contract? Who's going to hold those cost share contracts? Who's going to do the cost share contract or the cost share inspections that are required to be done on projects that are funded through this? Some of this was a little bit different for the Watershed District. We had never had a state cost share contract, at least not in recent memory, or a state cost share grant. So, developing how this is all going to play out. And it's going to be different for every organization. With the policy committee, are they going to meet every month like a regular board and look at and approve all projects? Are they going to meet quarterly and maybe give the board of the grant holder some authority to move projects forward? That's the area that we've ended up going in. The Watershed District is the one that is the fiscal agent and holds the grant, and so officially approves the contracts. And the policy committee has set a dollar amount. We only meet quarterly, and they want to see any project that is over $30,000 and decide then if they're going to recommend it for funding or not. Any of the projects beyond that, if they've ranked appropriately, then they go straight to the Watershed Board and the Watershed approves them. And again, not every group is going to work the same. It really has to be decided what's going to work for your partners and for that group of individuals. And it doesn't have to look the same. It probably shouldn't look the same for everyone. So one thing that, we did, and you're not going to be able to read this entire chart, it's pretty small, but during our initial planning for implementation phase, well, you might be able to read most of it. We set down a flow chart of how we expect this all to work. We decided that the Watershed District is going to hold the grants, but all projects that are going to be funded with the watershed-based implementation funds, and that's not the only funding source, but this is specifically for those funds, is going to start with the SWCDs. They're going to rank the practice. They're going to meet with the engineers and have it designed and everything. If it ranks and it meets the minimum, then they send it to the Watershed Board for approval. And it's decided at that point if it needs to go to policy committee or if the Watershed District just approves it based on the dollar amounts. If it needs to go to policy, it waits until it can be presented to all of them. Then they send it out for recommendation and then goes back to the Watershed District Board. And so this will work differently for everybody. We've kind of decided as a group and in our MOA that if a policy committee says that they do not recommend it for funding, then the Watershed District will deny the contract. In order to do it that way, we had to look at some real agreements and everything. We signed agreements with the SWCDs of shared responsibility because now we are holding the contract on a state cost share contract on a project, and we're holding the grant for that. But they are overseeing and certifying that it was built appropriately, that it was built to specs. They're going to do um, the cost share inspections that are necessary and then submit us the appropriate paperwork. So we did some agreements up of shared responsibility. Um, the SWCDs did an internal resolution that to um, to say that, yeah, they were going to implement these. Um, we did some agreements with lawyers and stuff to hold each other harmless for our individual parts of the projects. There was a lot of things to consider, things that we didn't really think about during the planning phase, but really came to light is when we were doing the actual practical aspect now of all working together to put these projects on the ground. The Watershed District had to write a state cost share policy. We did not have one in place for that. And we had to consider about, so our one watershed, one plan planning boundary is bigger than our legal watershed district boundary. We had to have conversations about that, about the fact that we are now holding cost share contracts for landowners that don't live in our legal boundary. And there was conversations with Bowser about that. Was that allowed? And it is, because it's different. It's the planning boundary, and it's again just for this grant funds. There's other funding mechanisms, and I am going to just touch on those briefly at the end here on some of those other funding mechanisms that exist out here. We developed a ranking and tracking progress of how we were going to keep track of everything, because now we have, 4 different entities. Well, mostly 4 different, well, 4 different SWCDs, and then the Watershed District are the main day-to-day ones working on these. Yes, the counties are partners, but they're not usually directly involved in the day-to-day part of the plan. They're more serving on the policy committee and as that aspect, the governing body. And then looking at making sure that the plan is being used. Does everybody have the same data? Do they have access to the data? How are we going to store all this data? Who's responsible for the data storage? It's just a lot of little things to figure out and make sure to put together, making sure that everybody understood where the priority sub-watersheds, that they had those shape files, getting them to the engineers. And then looking at making sure that everybody understood when we were looking at doing projects that it's not always about, if this is a good project or not. We've had projects that come across our desks and it's been, this is a great project. There's nothing wrong with it, but is it one of our priority BMPs? Did it fall in a priority area of this plan? And if the answer is no, it doesn't mean it isn't a project that doesn't get done or isn't a project that's beneficial to the watershed. It just means that we are not going to fund it with these funds and through this mechanism or process that we've set up. The Watershed District could still decide to do a big project somewhere else that is part of more of our local, maybe priority list. So it isn't the be all to end all. Another thing we really wanted to look at when it comes to using the plan is it isn't only about projects that are done with the watershed-based funding. What do we do about projects that, that were done with our federal partners or other state agencies, DNR? How can we get access to that data? And how can we report that in with all the other things that we were doing? Because that's going to be part of telling our story to the legislators, to the public, of what we're accomplishing with these plans. There's plenty of good work that gets done out there that fits into our comprehensive plans and is meeting our goals that isn't necessarily funded with this fund. So a big part for us was developing a ranking and a tracking sheet. We wanted something that was easy to use, that the data is easily accessible, that's changeable and adjustable. So I'm going to pull up just our sheet here really quick. I'm not going to go into too much detail on it, but we actually ended up using a Google Doc where everybody could log in, could enter their items. We came up with a scoring sheet where we put point values in. What we decided was important. More points if it's a larger watershed, if it's a larger impacted area by the project. Water storage is a big part of our plan. So does it achieve that? How far from a water body is it? Does it cover multiple priority concerns? Is there other funding? And this part is adjustable. It automatically turns this as approved, yes or no, depending on how many points this adds up to. And as we need to get more selective on projects, if we're having just, a ton of applicants and we really need to narrow it down more, we can change these point values. We can change this bar of, where this turns green and where it turns no. Maybe we'd have a yellow, where, okay, we'll go back to this project if we're at the end of the life of the grant and we're wanting to make sure that we get, projects on the ground before we're turning money back over to the state, because that's nothing any of us ever want to do, is give the state back money once they've already given it to us. This automatically populates over to the tracking. So in here, we put in, funds encumbered, when it was approved, what rate the cost share is. There's a place to put in reductions and everything, so that at the end of the year and when it comes time for e-link reporting, I'm not chasing down, 4 different agencies trying to get numbers from everybody to get that all put in at the last minute. We have a reminder of our flow sheet. We have some other accomplishments in there so that we can keep track of things like, water quality certification applications, well sealings. So there's all kinds of different ways you could do this or different ideas, but part of that was also trying to come up with ways that we are keeping track of or finding a way to track other things that are done outside of this funding. And it's an ongoing and process that keeps evolving. I'll take a few questions, and then if we only got till 1:30, but then I was just going to touch on, I just put together a few slides of just some other funding mechanisms that are out there for watershed districts. Something in the chat. Get it to pop up. Possible get copies of the slides. Yes, all the presentations are going to be, my understanding is, Jan can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is all the presentations are going to be available on the MOD website.
Yeah, sometime next week they'll be posted in the online library.
Jan and Michelle, I think, do you have other stuff you're going to walk through, Michelle?
I could or I could not.
Well, I was going to say, if you have these things here, that slide you just showed up might be of value, because I think the one thing I was going to offer is see if there's any questions about the funding and the funding opportunities and those mechanisms. But I think what you have here might be an opportunity to walk us through that.
Yeah, so I was just gonna, because that's always the thing is, we have all these great things that we want to do, and where do we get these funds? And so, sometimes, remember there's other things out there. We've piggybacked quite a bit with like, federal equip funds, and to help bring, there's been some great projects that have been put out there, and landowners were not able to implement them because sometimes equip will pay almost 100% of the project, and sometimes you might get 40% of the project since it's all done on flat rates. Us being able to utilize that, for one, is a big proponent of our match. And then for two, it then now creates a project that maybe wasn't feasible before funding wise for a landowner to actually implement. But now it is, because we can raise that level of cost share that's become available. And we found that these projects were really the ones that we first got started with, because a lot of them were designed sitting in a drawer and just waiting for either, equip funds to become available. And sometimes some of the projects were ones that were proposed for equip, but there was no funding available. But here now they're shovel ready for us. The engineering's been done. So while we're paying for the construction, we didn't have to put in any funding for the engineering of the project. And so that's another way to utilize those partners. We've helped with, some of the SWCDs have used their own state cost share, and then on projects, and we've contributed one watershed, one plan funding to that also. We've piggybacked with 319 grants in the same way that we've done with equip. And again, that goes towards our match because those are federal dollars. There's Clean Water Partnership loans, which I haven't had any experience with, but that is something that's available to watershed districts that can take out. And I have a little bit of something on my computer. There's funding out there that is in statute that is available to watershed districts that is not utilized much. And I don't know a ton about these, but I did put some slides together. And even if we don't get to them all for time wise, I'll keep them in the presentation because I have the statute numbers and everything on them and a little bit of a description. And so it is something that you can go back and look at. One of those is water management districts. And we can put these inside a organized watershed district. You can have a special water management district that can be identified. My understanding with this is that, they have to be for projects that are initiated under certain statutes, and the statutes are listed there. One of those is a stormwater, and I have a slide on that one too. And we do have to amend the plan for those. Now, Kevin can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is we wouldn't necessarily have to amend our one watershed, one plan if we had this was done just through the watershed district.
It's English Shepherd with a toy. Oh, he won't like English Shepherd. Bernie and Robert
We had
have
a
one.
internal plan of projects that we were trying to implement. It would we could identify them in there, but they have to be identified in a plan. And if they're going to be created, that plan needs to be amended.
Well, I think I got a little bit of that in between of hearing about English shepherds. So if you're going to fund it with watershed district funds and you have it in like your capital improvement project, you could fund it with the watershed district funds. If you're looking at using, the comprehensive plan under one watershed, one plan, and looking to use watershed based implementation dollars, that goes towards that. But The watershed-based implementation dollars is to fund those priority projects within the One Watershed One Plan projects. The hope is that your comprehensive, your CIP and your One Watershed One Plan are reflective of the same things. And as long as it's identified towards achieving the goals and objectives, you could do that. In terms of an amendment, I mean, the amendment process is not all that arduous to go in and say, hey, we have a couple of projects now that we didn't initially identify, can we add them in? It's like, yeah, you add those in and you go through the amendment process and they're amended and you can go ahead and do those things. The one thing that to keep in mind with that is in particular with One Watershed One Plan, we want it to be more of an active living sort of document. So unlike watershed district plans in the past, where it's been every 10 years you're doing a plan, and unless you have something really significant, maybe the second half of your plan, or you're doing a rules update, the amendment process was a little bit lengthier to go through. We want to try to have this so that every few years, maybe you're really assessing and say, all right, here's what we thought, but things have changed, we got a lot more accomplished, so we need to go through an amendment and be able to adapt and adjust for that. But if you want to use watershed district funds to fund One Watershed One Plan, certainly if you have something that if you have competitive projects and practices, you have cost share dollars, you have other things, those can be identified in any state approved plan essentially. So if you have something that you picked up that you want to funding wise that you want to apply towards your plan or an SWCD plan or One Watershed One Plan, you can do that without needing to do an amendment. The One Watershed One Plan is going towards those comprehensive watershed management plans.
Right. Yep. And I was just kind of looking at some other funding also that are available that's non-One Watershed One Plan funding that was available to watershed districts. So like the WML for stormwaters. Pelican River is doing this right now. And they've actually levied funds that can only be spent on stormwater and runoff related practices. But this is funds that can be levied outside of our 250 cap. There is other funding mechanisms out there that aren't utilized by watershed districts very often. And so these last few slides are just some of those statutes and some of those ideas that that we've talked about recently, and some people have actually started to utilize. But I will just kind of leave it at that. If anybody else had any other questions, or always feel free to.
There is one in the chat, Michelle.
All these screens.
So maybe I'll address that. So One Watershed One Plans, do they include the watershed districts and water management organizations? So outside the metro, there are not, I mean, you run into maybe an alphabet soup in terms of definitions and terms. Watershed management organization in the broad sense includes the joint powers watershed management organizations that Lewis talked about this morning with the metro with the municipalities and watershed districts. So outside the metro, there are not the joint powers watershed management organizations that are specifically referenced in 103B, statute 103B. One Watershed One Plans do include the watershed districts, outside the metro. In the metro, it's a little bit different process in that it's more, they don't have to, because of the 103B and being a added level of requirements and authorities with the metro districts and joint powers organizations. It's optional. We do have a few areas that are covering watersheds that encompass both metro, non-metro areas. So for example, the lower St. Croix watershed has a one watershed, one plan that includes both entities within the metro and then outside the metro. And it does include some joint powers watershed management organizations. Similarly with the Cannon River watershed, it covers in the South Metro, both metro and non-metro areas. And those, if those organizations choose to participate, they can do that. And in those two particular watersheds, they have chosen to do so.
All right, Michelle, if that's everything and there's no more questions, then I guess we'll just take a very short break. We'll be back at 1:45 and finish up our day. We'll see you shortly.